Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin the explanation of the bill, I would like to ask the clerk to report House Committee Substitute 1.
Clerk, please report.
House Committee Substitute 1 to House Bill 354.
Gentleman from Bullitt.
Move for its adoption.
Motion is for the adoption of House Committee Substitute 1. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, those in favor signify by voting aye. Those opposed, nay. House Committee Substitute 1 is adopted. Gentleman from Bullitt.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, you are going to be very familiar with this bill. I have filed similar legislation a number of years in the past. This is the first time that we have made it to the House floor, and I'm very excited for that opportunity to present to members of this body this good piece of legislation. When we vote later this morning, this will not be your first vote for the content that is included in House Bill 354. The members of this body who were here in the 2020 session and those that were here in the 2021 special session have voted on this idea, this bill, what we're talking about today, through executive orders from the governor with advice from the feds, the CAPA CS, that is the collaborative agreement for a nurse practitioner to write a prescription for controlled substances, were suspended. And so from March, April of 2020 until January of this year, when we took up those emergency orders again, nurse practitioners were able to write prescriptions for controlled substances without having a collaborative agreement with a physician. So during that time, we were able to gather some very important data that we're able to look at now and examine. So we have 7 quarters of CASPR data that reflect that during that time, prescription writing for controlled substances was not the wild, wild west. We heard that term earlier this week on the floor talking about another matter. It was not the wild, wild west. Nurse practitioners were not writing prescriptions hand over fist for controlled substances and flooding the state with opioids. That's another whole separate issue. Fentanyl, heroin, those things coming into the state, those need to be addressed, but that's not being addressed today in this bill. So 7 quarters of data, we didn't see any significant, there was no increase among nurse practitioners, physicians, dentists, those that were writing scripts for controlled substances. So let's get to the essence of this bill today. What this bill does is it says that after a nurse practitioner has been in a collaborative agreement for 4 years with a physician, that's currently the law, that they will have the ability to petition the Board of Nursing, that's their regulatory board, to come out from under that collaborative agreement. Now let me say that since the year 2006, I was not a member of this body then. In 2006, nurse practitioners were given the ability to write prescriptions for controlled substances with a collaborative agreement. So this is not a new concept. This is not something new that is happening. Since 2006, this has been going on. In order for a nurse practitioner to be relieved of the collaborative agreement, and there's nothing in this bill that would stop a nurse practitioner from remaining under a collaborative agreement if they choose to do that. That's their option. And they can work with a physician to set any of the guidelines that they want to for the collaborative agreement. They have that right, they have that ability, they can do that. This says that they petition the Board of Nursing. The Board of Nursing examines the record of the nurse practitioner, their prescription writing, their overall conduct over the last 4 years. and only until that board of nursing, which I would remind you is their regulatory board. We're going to hear a lot of discussion today. We may hear some discussion today. I hear it frequently about placing nurse practitioners under the Board of Medical Licensure or putting them under another board. In 2020, I circulated a letter to the Federal Trade Commission on a bill that I had filed related to this very subject, and the Federal Trade Commission responded that due to the nature of the remaining days of the session, they did not have time to issue an opinion relative to the bill that I had filed. But there was a Kansas bill that had been filed, and that Kansas bill followed along the same guidelines of what we were attempting to do in Kentucky. And the bottom line is, the Federal Trade Commission said, you can't do that. You're placing an authorized individual provider under a separate board that should not be regulating that board. The Federal Trade Commission advocates for free enterprise, and that was basically their conclusion there, that we can't do that. I wanted to address that early. So when the nurse practitioner petitions their governing authority and there's an examination done to determine their record, then after a period of evaluation of that nurse practitioner, if they are in good standing, only when they are notified in writing by the Board of Nursing would they be allowed to then write prescriptions for controlled substances without being under a collaborative agreement. If at any time after this collaborative agreement is lifted, there is concern, there is excessive writing of scripts, there's not following the guidelines from the Board of Nursing, the Board of Nursing can take the action under the authority that they have to place that nurse practitioner back under a collaborative agreement, or take further action as they deem necessary as the authority that oversees those nurse practitioners. So that, in essence, is a huge part of the bill. There is an addition to the bill. We may hear today that the nurse practitioners, maybe myself, I don't know if I'll be included in that or not, have not been willing to work with those that wanted to make additions to the bill or had differing ideas. That is not accurate. I worked with the gentleman from Nelson. He came to me with a recommendation. Let me find that. This is a disadvantage when you have a lot of paperwork, but I try to be prepared. So the gentleman from Nelson recommended this language, which we incorporated in the bill. I read it, looked at it, talked to the folks that I was working with, and came back and said, this is reasonable. And it says, an advanced practice registered nurse who chooses to practice without a Kappa CS shall be held to the same standard of care as all providers with prescriptive authority. So we're not asking in this bill for any special treatment. This wording here suggests that. I thought that it was good. Those that I was working with, they thought it was good as well. Nurse practitioners don't want any special treatment. They want to be held to a high standard because they value the profession that they have. They want to maintain the integrity of that profession. So we had another addition to the bill. I met with the Speaker. The Speaker of this body had a recommendation or something that he wanted to see incorporated into the bill to give it teeth to make it better. I met with him, we discussed, we talked about it, we talked about language, and came back with this inclusion to the bill. And I think it's a good component. It establishes the Controlled Substance Prescribing Review Panel. And with it, it sets up the Inspector General and the executive director of the boards of dentistry, medical licensure, and nursing. In addition to that, it adds 3 active prescribers from each board. We have equal representation from each of those entities that would write prescriptions for controlled substances. This board reviews quarterly reports. The teeth to this board, and I think this is a good addition because I think all of us would acknowledge that we have a problem with opioids in this state. We have a problem with that issue, and it's a big problem, and it's one that we really need to exhaust all avenues to get to the bottom of and determine what is happening. So each board would have their own investigator. If there are areas that are flagged as suspicious or are reported to this review panel, then those are investigated. These investigators would complete an investigation and would then turn the information for that prescriber over to the proper entity that oversees that particular prescriber. And there's a requirement in there that they have a response. So with this review panel, we are going to hold responsible those individuals that are writing prescriptions for controlled substances. We're going to hold dentists, we're going to hold physicians, and we're going to hold nurse practitioners accountable. And all 3 should be held accountable and held to high standards. They will be required to meet. They will have an annual report that is due, the first report due December 1st of 2022, and thereafter they will report each December 1st to the General Assembly. This provision sunsets on July 15th, 2026, and it would be the prerogative of the General Assembly to reauthorize the meeting of that review council. So this component adds teeth to this bill. It adds strength. It may very well help us get to the bottom of some problems that are existing out there, if they are existing. But the data will certainly be worthwhile for us to have. The problems that may surface will be worthwhile for us to know. That is a summation of House Bill 354. Later, I'm sure you are going to be asked to consider at least 4 floor amendments, 3 of which have been previously filed and 1 which was filed this morning. The one that was filed this morning, you're going to be asked to suspend the rules to hear that amendment. The other amendments you're going to be asked to adopt. I am imploring and asking the members of this body not to adopt those amendments, not to suspend the rules, because in essence what we are dealing with are amendments that have been in bill form in past sessions that have not been adopted by the General Assembly. They in essence will gut the bill that we have before them and make some demands that we simply can't implement in this bill and move forward as we're planning and as we want to with this piece of legislation. And I ask the members of this body not to adopt those amendments. Before I yield to the lady from Warren 20, who is the primary co-sponsor for the minority party on this bill, I want to remind the members of this body, we have twice before voted on the contents of this legislation minus the review panel. This is not something new that we voted on. Anyone who has voted on those executive orders in the past and that process that we went through has cast a yes vote in this area. With this bill, we are making available to the people of Kentucky added providers. Folks will say, well, we don't have, nurse practitioners aren't necessarily right now moving to eastern Kentucky or southeastern Kentucky or western Kentucky. This will give them the opportunity to do that. This will give them the opportunity to serve the people of this state. And we are always talking about encouraging folks to enter the healthcare field. We hear discussion about a shortage of nurses that we have, and this bill will help with that. Mr. Speaker, I now move for the passage of House Bill 354 as amended by House Committee Substitute 1.
Gentleman from Bullock.
Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to offer some points of clarification. So, 95%, folks, just listen to this statistic. 95% of primary care slots in the state of Kentucky are being filled. That does not suggest that we have a large number of folks out there that are not taking advantage of the opportunity to become a primary care physician. So to suggest that this bill somehow will reduce that, the evidence just does not point to that. And we have 7 quarters of data that back up that if you had individuals that didn't want to fill those slots, they would not be applying for those. And also to reference the 7 quarters of data that we have available on prescriptions for controlled substances, quite honestly, to suggest that nurse practitioners are solely responsible for the opioid epidemic that we have in this state and for the number of prescriptions that are being written, it's just plain wrong. And I've had folks suggest that this bill will cause greater problems. It will not. And I have never suggested, and I'm not saying that the lady from Kenton 64 was referencing me. I have never suggested that this bill will open the floodgates and nurses will return to Kentucky. That has never been an argument that I've made in presenting this bill. And I just wanted to add that clarification. I think it's important to remember we're not seeing primary care physicians, individuals leave that profession. Folks are going to that. There is room for both practitioners in the state of Kentucky. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.